Hello everyone and welcome to this series of videos entitled A Decade in the Life of the United States. It's a series of short videos in which I'm going to give presentations in the form of short timelines discussing or explaining the most important events that took place during different periods of the United States history, 19th century basically. United States history. I have divided these timelines into decades just for the sake of academic clarity and simplicity, not to mean that a decade is a separate and independent chronological unit that has nothing to do with the previous and the following decades or years. So as I said, this is just for the sake of academic clarity and simplicity. We will start with the 1790s, but before that we have to go back a little bit in time to the years 1788 and 1789. Why? Because the 1790s we witnessed the beginning of the implementation of the principles set in the Constitution. The government that the Constitution creates, this central government of the United States, is going to start operating in the 1790s with now the shift from disagreements over the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution as such, the existence of the Constitution. The disagreement is over now, and there is a new type or a new form of disagreement which is related to interpretations of the Constitution, not to ratification. So we go back a little bit in time to the year 1788. What is the significance of this year? It is the year when the necessary number of states ratified the Constitution, because the Constitution needed 9 states out of 13 to be ratified, to be official and legal, and not all the states ratify at the same time. There is this give and take between the Federalists and the anti-Federalists, and the Federalists are more organized, more strategically successful, and they succeed through a lot of compromises. The major compromise of these is the promise of the addition of a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights to the US Constitution. With this promise, with this compromise, opposition to the Constitution that are based on the fear that this new government that the Constitution creates is going to be tyrannical, oppressive, too powerful, and that it's going to threaten the power of the states and also the rights of individual citizens. So this disagreement is over, 1788, because Constitution is officially ratified. And in 1789 we see the government that this Constitution has created starting to operate, but before it starts operating it needs to expand a little bit and to give itself a certain form and certain aspects. The Constitution gives the principles and the guidelines of this government, but the creation and the operation of the different parts, the different branches of the government is going to take place gradually. Now, interestingly, the Constitution is operational starting from March the 4th, and the government that the United States Constitution creates starts operating. Now, we have in the Constitution the creation of 3 branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. The legislative branch is already there. We have the Confederation Congress before the ratification of the Constitution. We already have the Confederation Congress. It was a legislative body. So the legislative branch of this new government is already there. What the Constitution creates is it transforms the shape and the structure and the mechanisms by which this new already existing legislative branch operates through this bicameral bicameral legislative body, having the House of Representatives and the Senate, transforming the way laws are going to be made in the future, are going to be ratified, and also changing the representation issue, the representation mechanism, by combining between equal representation in the Senate and proportional representation based on population in the House of Representatives. So the legislative body is already there. It is, however, transformed significantly. It is given new mechanisms. And then this legislative branch is going to help in the creation and the operation of the other two branches. So this starts with the preparation of ballots of presidential electors, which is related to the executive. And on April the 30th, the executive branch is created by the election of, when I say created here, I mean created really, technically, and even physically, not just in principle, because the Constitution creates the executive branch in principles, in terms of principles. So we have April the 30th, George Washington is elected President of the United States. At this time, George Washington is not associated with any political party because at this time there is no such thing as political parties. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists used to be factions, just factions. Faction politics and party politics are different from one another. We have John Adams, Vice President. You can see this as a balance between South and North, Washington being from Virginia and Adams being from the North, from Massachusetts. So this might be a combination of these two people, or putting these two people together in the same team can be considered as a balance between North and South. So the executive branch is created, but the president and the vice president are not going to be the only components of this executive branch. We will see in a minute how this executive branch extends. As far as the judiciary is concerned, the Judiciary Act of 1789 is going to implement the principles that are established in Article 3, Section 1 of the US Constitution, which gives the judicial branch the power to create inferior institutions and courts that can help it to exercise its powers. So inferior federal courts are created as an implementation of Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution. And an interesting part of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which is going to play an important role and to be in a controversy that would take place a few years later, is Section 13, which gives the Supreme Court the power called writs of mandamus, which means that the Supreme Court is given by the Judiciary Act of 1789, which is an act of Congress. Remember, Congress, Legislative Act. The Section 13 gives the Supreme Court the power to issue orders or commands against public officers or to public officers, ordering them to perform certain tasks. We also have as I said before, the executive is now being extended, and it's George Washington who gives this executive branch this extended form by creating different departments. The executive, even though the Constitution does not explicitly say anything about the cabinet, there are some implied powers in the Constitution that give the executive branch the power to establish the necessary institutions and infrastructures that can help it operate and exercise its powers, which are mentioned in the Constitution. So the executive does not only include the president and the vice president, it starts or it extends and it includes, after the creation of a cabinet, the Department of Foreign Affairs, nowadays the State Department, headed at this time by Thomas Jefferson, the War Department, headed by Henry Knox, the Treasury Department by Alexander Hamilton, and the Post Office, uh, headed by Postmaster General Samuel Osgood. The Federal Judiciary Act creates or gives a structure to the Supreme Court made of six men, and the Chief Justice this time is John Jay. Remember that John Jay is one of the three people called Publius during the ratification process, the Federalist Papers. One of the three writers that contributed in writing the Federalist Papers. And Congress establishes the United States Army, which is a central army, different from the state militias. So we have this executive branch extended, and we have also the United States Army, which can be part of the or associated with the national government, with this new central government created by the Constitution. One of the important results of the cabinet that Washington creates is that Hamilton is going to use his position as Secretary of the Treasury to implement his vision of empowering the central government, and also his vision related to manufacturing. Hamilton believes that the United States can grow economically by giving some importance, or a lot of importance, to manufacturing. He has a lot of trust in the economic benefits of manufacturing. Being from the North, this is something that is much expected from him. So the tariffs, Hamilton's policy is based on economic policy as Secretary of Treasury. Is going to include a lot of elements. One of them is the tariff. The tariff is important for Hamilton, tariff on imported goods, because the tariff on imported goods can be a revenue for funding government operations, also for paying the war debts, the federal war debts that the federal government, the central government, inherits from the previous Confederation government. And also another role of these tariffs is to protect local manufactured goods. By raising tariffs, local manufactured goods would become cheaper than imported goods, because imported goods, due to the raise in the tariffs, would be more expensive. What happens is that this plan by Hamilton is going to be one of the seeds of the future split between the North and the South. There are many Southerners, especially farmers. Most of Southern people are farmers. Manufacturing is more present in the North, even though the United States, the entire United States, is a primarily agrarian society. We still have manufacturing more present in the North. It is still small-scale manufacturing, not large industries, but it is one of the significant differences between the North and the South. Sorry for the typing mistake, North and the South. And in the future, we will have this phenomenon of interpreting governmental decisions in terms of North and South, geographical terms, sectional terms. This phenomenon is going to appear many times, leading to the split or the Civil War in the 1860s. An important event that takes place outside the United States, but which has a direct, most of the time, it's a direct impact on internal affairs and internal conflicts, is the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. This is a revolution that starts as a reaction against the excesses of the monarchy, and there are different phases that this revolution is going to go through, and some of the phases of this revolution are going to be more violent and more aggressive, more radical, more chaotic, between quotation marks, from the perspective of many Americans. So there are going to be different interpretations, different attitudes towards this revolution in the United States. Some people are going to favor it as a as a as a sign that republicanism, the Republican spirit, which is considered a positive thing in the United States, is spreading in the rest of the world, and thus the United States has to assist in spreading this Republican spirit. There are the ones who look at this revolution as anarchy or chaos and something that the United States should be wary of. So just keep this in mind for the future. We have also in intellectual and cultural developments, we have the beginning of the publication of the Gazette of the United States, a newspaper that is biased in favor of the Federalists and the Federalist agenda. We don't have a notion of Federalist Party yet. We have the Federalist faction, but we have a newspaper that is published among other things to promote the interest of the Federalists and the agenda, the ideology, the interpretations of the Federalists. And an important development also in terms of culture and intellectual affairs is the publication of the interesting life of Oluda Equiano, who is a former slave, and this is the first published American slave narrative. Slave narrative can be considered as a genre or a subgenre. As early as 1789, we have a lot of blacks. Some of them are former slaves. Some are blacks that were born free, who are going to be involved in publications of literary works, of scientific works, and who are going to be very active at this time. In the revolution, there are some states that give free blacks the right to vote, but in the future, some of these states are going to take that right away from black people. So there is a strange shift back towards stereotyping of African Americans or slaves or former slaves or blacks. But at this time, we have signs that there are some former slaves, some black Americans that are going to be very active intellectually and in the future even politically, and some of them are going to become activists and abolitionists. We also have the establishment of Georgetown University in DC, the District of Columbia, Washington DC nowadays, which becomes the first Catholic university founded in the United States. 1790 now, we start with the decade 1790s. So what is going to happen? We have the establishment of the District of Columbia, which is going to be the future site of the United States government. Nowadays, it's called Washington, D.C. There is a territory, a square territory, as you see in the map, that is ceded by the two states, Virginia and Maryland, along the Potomac River. That is going to be the new site of the government in the future. It's like a balance. Hamilton's tariff can be seen as favoring northern manufacturers. So, like a bargain, the South is going to have this shift of the seat of government from New York, Philadelphia, and then to Maryland and Virginia, which means the site of the government is going to be in the South in the future. Then we have the movement of the seat of government from New York City to Philadelphia. We don't have Washington, D.C. yet. We don't have even D.C., so it's established as a district, but it is going to be built and organized in the future. We also have the U.S. Supreme Court meeting for the first time, the judicial branch. It meets in the Old Merchants Exchange on Wall Street. Wall Street has always been an important place, financial seed for the United States economic history as early as 1790s. So the Supreme Court, as you noticed, does not have a building, its own building, its own establishment. So because at this time, even though the judicial branch is created by the Constitution, it's not given much definition and it's not given much importance. It will evolve gradually, and during Jefferson's presidency, during the Jeffersonian era, the judicial branch is going to evolve significantly. The creation of the Coast Guard is also an important event because it is used as a way to guarantee the United States protection of United States shores. But this year we have another part of Hamilton's economic plan, which is based on his report on public credit. This report leads to the assumption of states' Revolutionary War debts by the National Congress, by the United States Congress. We have the central government taking over the war debts. And this is opposed by many states, by many politicians inside the United States, especially southern states. Now, the reason why Hamilton wants the U.S. Congress to assume the war debts of the states is like an attempt to give this new central government a better image, to increase or to improve its reputation among citizens. When the central government helps the nation get rid of the war debts, it would become more attractive to American citizens, and also its economic value, its economic status among other nations is going to increase. So I don't want to get into details related to economy, but this is one of the reasons why this is important for Hamilton. Another important development related to Hamilton's financial plan is the beginning or an important transformation in manufacturing, which is Samuel Slater's textile mill that he establishes by the financial help of some wealthy person in Rhode Island. Sorry for the spelling mistake. So even though at this time we don't have large-scale manufacturing or industry, but we have the seeds of the future American version of the British Industrial Revolution, which is going to have significant impacts on the society, on the US economy, and also on the United States government. It's usually associated with Hamilton because Hamilton is a political leader who favors manufacturing. We have the first federal census that counts 4 million American citizens, or American inhabitants, sorry. As far as territories are concerned, we have Southwest Territory, which later on would become the state of Tennessee, would be admitted to the Union. The Southwest Territory is created. The Northwest Ordinances give or establish certain mechanisms by which territories are organized and then are admitted to the Union as states. So we will witness throughout the 19th century, many territories are organized as territories first, and then they become states. So most of the time, before becoming a state, these new states are first organized as territories. 1791, we have a continuation of the plan of establishing the new government site in the District of Columbia with the French-born architect Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, who makes the plan for the streets and public buildings of this new District of Columbia. And in the future, it's going to be established, and the public building is going to be called the White House after 1818. Now George Washington is still alive. It's called the District of Columbia, but in the future it will be called Washington, D.C. Another important political development in this year is the admission, the ratification of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. This can be considered like a compromise, a counterweight or a counterbalance to the centralization process that the Constitution has been or has created. So there is centralization of government, there is empowering of the central government, but to make sure or to give a promise that this central government would not exceed its powers, would not violate the powers of citizens and of states. This Bill of Rights is implemented like a counterbalance. So the Bill of Rights includes certain, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 articles that are, or amendments that are added to the Constitution. They function as a counterbalance or counterweight to the central, the empowering of the central government. The First Amendment is freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. This is what the First Amendment guarantees. The second one, the right to keep and bear arms in order to maintain a well-regulated militia. The First and Second Amendments are among the, I would say, the most controversial amendments and problematic amendments that are going to face different interpretations, disagreements in the future, especially the Second Amendment, where you have the right to bear arms is interpreted by some people as being concerned only with the militia, while other ones take this to the individual, the level of individuals, and the controversy is still going on. We also have the Third Amendment, no quartering of soldiers. It's like a guarantee that the scenario that took place during the 18th century, the British soldiers, the Quartering Act, the Boston Massacre, soldiers and army are always going to be associated with tyranny and power. This is why, tyranny and oppression, this is why many Americans disagree with the idea of having a strong national army at this time. The Fourth Amendment, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. This is related to the search warrant that you sometimes see in movies, that some people ask from the FBI or from other officers before they can give them access to their houses to search. In the United States, this is one of the civil liberties that is protected by many organizations and activists. Now it is interpreted in different contexts. Seizing property or searching property is now implemented or interpreted as including not just physical property but also digital, virtual property, the internet and privacy, emails, and so on and so forth. 5, the right to due process of law, freedom from self-incrimination, double jeopardy, very similar to the English constitutional tradition, the Magna Carta. 6, rights of accused persons, like the right for a speedy and public trial. Many of these rights are related to the judicial, are judicial in their nature, judicial and legal rights related to legal procedures. Right of trial by jury in civil cases, freedom from excessive bail, cruel and unusual punishments. Other rights of the people that are not explicitly mentioned here, but that might appear later on. And very important part of the Bill of Rights is the 10th Amendment, which says that the powers not explicitly given to the central government, the federal government by the Constitution, are going to be reserved to the states or to the citizens of the United States of America. And related to the 10th Amendment that we have already mentioned, we have another part, another element in Hamilton's plan, which is related to the previous ones. Public credit, previously the tariff. Now we have the Bank of the United States. The creation of the first Bank of the United States. For Hamilton, the bank is necessary because it's a mechanism by which this new government is going to operate financially, collecting taxes, collecting tariffs, sponsoring and financing investment in manufacturing and so on. So capitalism in the future and industry are going to be closely connected and interdependent. And in relation, this is seen by some Americans, especially Jefferson, as a violation, and also Madison, as a violation of the 10th Amendment. How is the creation of the bank a violation of the 10th Amendment? It is considered as such because the Constitution does not explicitly give the federal government the power to create a bank. So according to Jefferson and Madison, the bank is unconstitutional. Whereas Hamilton is going to claim that the Bank of the United States is not an exercise of a new power, but it's just a means by which this new government can exercise a power that is already given to it in the Constitution. The power to regulate trade, interstate trade, and trade with foreign nations. For Hamilton, the bank is just a means by which this trade is regulated through managing these financial interactions, the sponsoring, the collection of tax money and revenue from tariffs, which is related to the power of the government to regulate trade. In addition to this, there is the Whiskey Act, which puts a tax on whiskey and other alcoholic drinks. The idea is that whiskey and alcohol are luxurious products, and taxing luxury is not supposed to be a problem. But for many farmers in the United States, this is a burden. This is a financial burden on farmers. And this is like a confirmation that this new government is implementing laws that favor the North through the tariffs, through encouraging manufacturers, and issuing laws that do not serve the interests of the farmers, especially the South, because most farmers, or the South, is predominated by farming and by agriculture. So we have this impression, we have this Whiskey Act that is going to create the impression that the government is acting unfairly towards farmers. So, and also the states pass laws that protest the tax because they consider the tax as an unfair burden to farmers. We have the Northwest Territory. In the Northwest Territory, Chief Little Turtle defeats General Arthur St. Clair, and we notice in the 19th century, throughout the whole 19th century, from the beginning of the 19th century, from the end of the 18th century and throughout the whole 19th century, many battles that take place between the United States government and the Indian tribes. Basically, there are two strategies used by these Indian tribes. One of them is resistance whenever it's possible, and when there isn't a possibility of uniting against the United States government, these tribes, some of them sometimes many of them, confederations and unions of tribes, use the strategy of diplomacy and adjustment. There are some of them who even try to adopt white men's social structures or political systems. We have in this year Vermont Republic is admitted as a state. So there are many states that before becoming a state, they are independent political entities, or they are political entities that belong to other nations, which we will see in the future. We have a very good example, similar example is the Republic of Texas. In this year, Thomas Paine publishes the book collection of 31 articles entitled The Rights of Man, in which he defends the people's right to revolt against the government when the government does not protect the natural rights, the people's natural rights of liberty, life, and property. And he uses the arguments in these articles to defend the French Revolution. In the United States, we have some people who agree with Tom Paine in his attitude towards rebellion, towards revolution, towards the French Revolution in particular, and the right of people to revolt and to rebel against government in general. But there are a lot, especially the Federalists, later on the Federalist Party, who are going to see this spirit of rebellion as a threat to the United States security, stability, and a threat to republicanism. In this year also, Benjamin Banneker, a black mathematician and astronomer, publishes Almanac and Ephemeris. So we have another example of intellectual activism of people of African origin. So this can be used, or this would contradict with the stereotypes and the practices, that even the legal practices that are going to be followed or pursued by some states, especially southern pro-slavery states in the future, where there is prohibition of slaves, or prohibiting the slaves from getting access to education, and the stereotypes that these slaves of African origin are not able to rely on themselves, and they don't have the necessary intellectual skills. So this is something that contradicts with what we see in this year. William Bartram publishes his book Travels, where he describes and illustrates the different types of flora and fauna, the plants and the animals that exist in North America, as far as the ones that exist in the territories that have already been discovered by the United States. So there are a lot of territories westward that haven't been discovered yet at this time, but the ones that are already discovered include a lot of variety in terms of animals and plants. So this attachment to the environment is going to be an important part of the American character, the American identity. Attachment to nature, it's at certain times it takes the form of environmental activists and activism, people who want to protect the environment from the perils of industry, perils of urbanization. And it is also associated with some literary, artistic, and even some philosophical and religious movements, like the Transcendentalist movement, that associates itself with nature, that builds a close connection with the natural landscape, and sees and also Romanticism. Romantic literature is closely connected to nature and to the environment. So even though this publication this year is perhaps purely scientific and biological, still there are other aspects of nature which are not merely scientific and biological, but which are artistic, philosophical, cultural, and even religious. Another related aspect, or another publication related to American character, particularities of the United States, thinking and philosophy, is Benjamin Franklin's, the publication of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. We are going to witness in the 19th century and even beyond some disagreements, some controversies over the identity of the United States as a nation and the identity of Americans especially in relation to race, in relation to color, to religion, to faith, to political principles. And this identity is a combination of different aspects that are sometimes symbolized or epitomized by different people. You can take Jefferson as a symbol of liberty or liberalism. Take Benjamin Franklin here as a representative of the American spirit of self-reliance, of independence, of this auto-didactic person, the well-rounded man, the man who is successful in many parts or many aspects of life, political, intellectual, philosophical. So this idea of individualism, self-reliance, building oneself from zero, which is opposed to the European traditions of aristocracy and heredity, is going to be one of the distinctive features of the American character or the American mind, the American myths, the American identity, and such related aspects. 1792, we have again the executive mansion, which is later on going to be the White House. There is the beginning of the building, the cornerstone of this U.S. executive mansion is established in this year. We also have George Washington re-elected President of the United States. George Washington at this time is still has some of the charisma that he had in his first term, but he is gradually losing it because of his association with Hamilton's program. George Washington, even though we can consider him as a neutral, not really belonging to one party or another, we notice that he is, as a president and as part of this executive branch, he is much in favor of Hamilton's plans, and he supports Hamilton's plans and the plans of the Federalists or the Federalist Party in general. And his association with these practices, with these plans, make him lose some of his popularity, and he becomes, as a result of this, he becomes victim to much criticism during his time, to the point where he feels the need to defend himself indirectly in the farewell address, which we will discuss in a few minutes. As a continuation of Hamilton's plan, we have the Coinage Act, which is passed to establish the United States Mint, which is going to produce the currency, coins, and in the future the papers or the bills of the United States. Now, currency is going to be a very important aspect of the United States economic development. At this time, it is not very significant because the United States, especially being an agrarian society, being a primarily agrarian society, and being just at the beginning of experiencing this banking system, is still dominated in many areas, especially in the South, by the bartering, the exchange of goods between different people instead of the use of currency. But gradually, especially with the growth of population, with the expansion of the nation geographically, there is a transformation towards using paper money and currency instead of using goods and bartering. And this is going to be related to have an impact on the development of the United States, and also an impact on the differences that are going to exist between the North and the South. Another development is the Buttonwood Agreement, where different merchant and stockbrokers, if we can call them so, sign an agreement to establish in the future the New York Stock Exchange. So we see the origins of what the United States would become later on. At this time, the United States is still a primarily agrarian society. Nowadays, when we think of the United States, we always associate it with industry, with capitalism, but at this time, in 1790s, the United States is still a primarily agrarian society, and we see the seeds of the future transformation of the United States into the capitalist and the industrial giant. Territory, from perspective of, as far as the territories are concerned, we have the Kentucky, which used to be part of Virginia, is now going to become an independent state. It's the 15th state after Vermont. It's the 15th state that is added to the United States of America. In the future, Kentucky is going to play an important role in 1798 along with Virginia. And diplomatically, we have Thomas Pinckney, who is sent to Great Britain as the first U.S. or United States diplomat to be sent to Britain. Now we have the beginning of beginning of an era where the United States, especially the Federalists or the Federalist Party, tries to have some diplomatic solutions to certain disputes between the U.S. and Great Britain, especially after witnessing that Great Britain does not respect its obligation of the 1783 Treaty of Paris. 1793, we have an important judicial decision by the Supreme Court, Alexander Chisholm versus the state of Georgia, in which the Supreme Court gives a favorable decision to this citizen of North Carolina against the state of Georgia in the case that involves payments due to this person from the state of Georgia because of Revolutionary War debts that the state of Georgia owes to a company that is controlled or run by this citizen. This is something that this decision is going to be repealed in the 11th Amendment, which we will see in the future. Thomas Jefferson resigns as Secretary of State. We witness here this cabinet is, especially after the economic and the financial agenda of Hamilton is implemented, this cabinet is going to fall apart with Jefferson, who is a very important part of this cabinet, resigning and moving to the opposition. So we witness here the building up of this party politics, where you have a political party in power and and the other one in opposition, and the beginning of disagreements, rivalry, organized opposition to the government, and an attempt to overthrow this government, of course, peacefully through winning the elections. We have related to Thomas Jefferson's resignation, who is going to be involved in this shift towards party politics. In Philadelphia, the first democratic Republican society which opposes President Washington's decisions and agenda, and this opposition is not directed to President Washington as such, but because Washington is the head of this executive branch that is implementing Hamilton's plans, so he is criticized by this newly formed Democratic Republican Party. And Philadelphia is as usual is the source of a lot of political and not intellectual and political developments. Again, we see Philadelphia the seat or the site of some of these developments. And this year we also have the Fugitive Slave Act, issued by the U.S. Constitution, issued by the U.S. Congress as an implementation of Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution. The framers of the Constitution did not want to abolish slavery, did not want to say much about slavery because they needed the ratification of the Constitution by a lot of southern states in which slavery was an important economic factor. So we see these compromises are going to lead to tighter and stricter laws concerning slaves, and then concerning even blacks, even free blacks in the future. So the United States Mint that we talked about earlier in Philadelphia is beginning its regular production, and the half-cent coin is minted. So currency is gradually going to be an important economic, an important aspect of the United States economy. Going back to external affairs, which are directly related to internal affairs, we witnessed the French Revolution, the shift in the French Revolution, becoming more violent by the execution of Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette, declaring war against Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. Because France is a republic at this time, it becomes a republic. It is a natural enemy of monarchies, and France as a there is this war between the European monarchies, which are afraid that the spirit of revolt and rebellion and the anarchy, between quotation marks, in France is going to contaminate and move to these monarchies and plague the powers in these monarchies. So war between France and Great Britain and even Spain is going to constitute a problem to the United States, because the United States does not want to get involved in these conflicts for the reason that it is not well prepared to fight any European power, France or Britain or any other power, and also it wants to maintain some economic advantages with all these nations. So neutrality is going to guarantee the economic benefits. This is why George Washington issues the Neutrality Proclamation, when this war between France and Great Britain starts. But the problem is that the British and the French, both the British and the French, are going to violate this neutrality. Britain seizes vessels, neutral vessels, traveling to France or the French West Indies, American vessels, claiming that since they are dealing with Britain's enemy, they are considered as allies of this enemy. So British use this as an excuse to capture, imprison, and impress American sailors. And France does something very similar. We have this year the famous or infamous Citizen Genet affair, the Genet affair occurring. So Genet is Edmond Genet is an envoy from France, this newly established government, Republic of France, is sent to the United States in order to ask for help, ask the United States assistance, financial assistance in its war against Britain. And this is something that many Americans at this time welcome, especially the Democratic Republicans. There is an association, friendship, mutual sympathy between the French revolutionaries and some Democratic Republicans, because the Democratic Republicans, including Jefferson, see the French Revolution as a continuation of the spread of republicanism that is started by the American Revolution, even though Jefferson considers the French Revolution as inferior or second to the American Revolution. So what happens is that Citizen Genet, before meeting the American government, starts using some American citizens, privateers, and some American ports in order to launch expeditions against Britain and against Great Britain and Spain. There are some American citizens, privateers, who are involved in this because they have some sympathy towards Genet and towards the French Republic. And this is why in the future, in the year 1794, there is an act of Congress prohibiting American citizens from joining foreign military service and foreign war vessels. The Geneva Affair is unaccepted, is not accepted by George Washington, even though Jefferson thinks that the United States should assist France because it is a republic, just like the United States. But the American government, led by George Washington and the Federalists, does not want to get involved and sees the Geneva Affair as a violation of the United States neutrality rights. And besides this, in the year 1794, the slave trade with foreigners is banned, with foreign nations is banned. And we have also the beginning of or the development of a certain distinct African American culture. Here it starts with religion, separate African American congregation established by Methodist preacher Richard Allen. So there are many aspects in which the African American community, or communities, I would say, because most of the time these groups do not have the opportunity to meet, to communicate with one another, especially that they are not, many of them are not given access to education and to writing letters and so on. So we have, nevertheless, development of a certain distinct African American culture among slaves, among former slaves, among freed blacks, that is going to continue to take different forms at different times in American history. Sometimes it is related to music, to sports, to literature, to certain forms of art, and so on. So we see the beginning of such a distinct African American culture. This year is also the time when whiskey rebellion takes place. The whiskey tax that we mentioned earlier, leads to opposition from many farmers, and it culminates in the whiskey rebellion, which is not a very violent rebellion, but it is very significant because it is a sign that this government is facing a lot of opposition from farmers. And these farmers see the government as tyrannical, as oppressive, and also as unfair to the farmers. There is a continuing and an increasing dissatisfaction with Washington's government, which so besides whiskey, the whiskey rebellion, besides being a rebellion of farmers, being a reason or a sign that the United States government is losing popularity among many farmers, it is also going to be a factor one of the factors which would make the Federalist Party lose the election of 1800. So there is another rebellion that is going to take place in 1799, similar rebellion, and with other, I would say, strategic mistakes by the Federalist government, the government in power. Besides these, we will see the shift from the Federalist Party to the Democratic Republican Party. The US Navy is established. Frigates are being built, beginning of building frigates, certain warships to protect American merchant ships. Now we don't have a strong American Navy, but it's the beginning of the establishment of a strong American Navy, which is going to be opposed by the Democratic Republicans. The Navy and an army are always associated with either tyranny or taxation, because sponsoring an army or a navy needs money and funding, and this funding is done through taxation, and the Democratic Republicans are usually against anything that might lead to the raise in taxes. The Navy is going to be an important element in the disagreements that take place between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, and even between different groups inside the Democratic Republican Party itself. We have, diplomatically speaking, we have Jay's Treaty in the year 1794. This is a very important development in this period, both from the external and the internal perspective. So Jay's Treaty is a treaty between the United States and the British government. John Jay, Special Envoy, John Jay, Chief Justice, is sent to Britain and negotiate with Foreign Minister William Grenville. And the treaty, among the provisions of the treaty, is the following. The United States gives trading rights for Britain, the privilege of the most favored nation in commerce, and there is some agreement over property rights for loyalists who are going to who return to the United States. So the loyalists who helped Britain in many of these loyalists who helped Britain in the War of the Revolution after independence lose their properties and they are stigmatized. So Jay's Treaty gives them some protection, especially in terms of their property. In return, Britain is going to remove its troops from America's Western territories. This is important for the United States because Britain, due to not respecting its obligations of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, represents a burden, an obstacle towards the American expansionist ambitions, especially that Great Britain is assisting in the Northwest Indians against the United States government. Compensation for American merchants and limited American trade in the West Indies. Now, Jay's Treaty is important because it helps the United States avoid a war with Britain, a war that would have perhaps led to disastrous consequences for the United States. So it was like a diplomatic solution for some problems that the United States had not been ready to solve through force. As a result of Jay's Treaty, the United States has more capacity to move westward, and with the disappearance of the obstacle of the British, General Anthony Wayne defeats the Northwest Indian Confederation in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And in this year, we have the publication of a narrative of the proceedings of the black people during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia by the two preachers, Richard Allen, who we have mentioned before, and Absalom Jones, in order to denounce the stereotyping against blacks in Philadelphia. So we witnessed at the beginning of the American Republic, a lot of blacks, former slaves, are involved in intellectually active through literature, through mathematics, and through activism. There is this activism here is very similar to the abolitionist movement that will appear in the 19th century United States. 1795, the 11th Amendment is presented to Congress, and the 11th Amendment is very short. We can read it. So what does it do? It protects the state governments from being sued by citizens of another state. So it nullifies or it repeals the court decision in Shisholm versus Georgia, which we mentioned earlier. It says the judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. So we see here the protection of the state governments from the Supreme Court and from citizens of other states. So we see the sovereignty of the state is being protected here. We also have the Naturalization Act of 1795, which repeals the Naturalization Act of 1790. 1790 Naturalization Act stipulates that the number of years of residence necessary for an immigrant to the US in order to get citizenship is 2. The Act of 1795 extends this to 5 years. So immigration policy by the government at different times in American history is going to be a very important element in political and social developments. A committee on commerce and manufacturers is established in Congress. The continuation of the movement towards encouraging manufacturing, which is going to be one of the factors why the United States would become in the future one of the largest industrial and capitalist countries in the world, besides Britain, and at certain times even more so than Britain. Another treaty that the United States signs in this year is Pinckney's Treaty, or the Treaty of Madrid, the Treaty of San Lorenzo. All names are the same thing. In this treaty, the United States gets favorable boundaries or boundary settlements with Spanish colonies. And also, the United States gets navigation rights on the Mississippi River and access to New Orleans. New Orleans and the Mississippi River are very important for especially Western farmers who do not have an easy access to Eastern ports, and thus they don't have an easy access to maritime trade. So the Mississippi River and New Orleans represent a very favorable commercial advantage to the people who have access to them. And in addition to the treaty, Pinckney's Treaty, and as a result of Jay's Treaty, which leads to the movement of the British troops from the western boundaries, from the Western Territories, Northwestern Territories, the United States, after defeating the Western Confederacy of Native American tribes, gets to sign the Treaty of Granville with the Western Confederacy, in which the Indian tribes are going to cede half of what is now Ohio to the United States and agree to move westward. And this marks the end of the long Northwest Indian War between the United States and the Northwest Indians. 1796, in this year, we have a very important electoral and political event, which is the election of John Adams, a member of the Federalist Party, to the presidency, and Thomas Jefferson as vice president. The Constitution, because it had not predicted the existence of political parties and the political system that results from this party dynamics and competition, did not specify anything about the relationship between the president and the vice president. Nowadays, and after the 12th Amendment had been added to the US Constitution, the electors vote for a team instead of for a person. So, in voting for a president, this entails that the vice president is part of the same team as the president. But at this time, 1796, it's a matter of the number of votes. How many votes does a candidate get? So the biggest number of votes goes to John Adams, and second in ranking is Thomas Jefferson. So the runner-up is Thomas Jefferson, and he becomes the vice president. We have a problem here. The president and the vice president are from different political parties, which are competing and disagreeing on a lot of issues. Another change is the replacement of John Jay as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by Oliver Ellsworth. Now, the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is going to be relevant and significant when John Marshall is appointed to it by John Adams. This is something we will see in the presidency of Thomas Jefferson and in the Jeffersonian and the Republican era in general. A very interesting speech and significant speech is President Washington's farewell address. Even though the speech or the address is not, sorry, I should have said the address is not entirely drafted by George Washington. There are parts of it that are drafted by Alexander Hamilton, especially the foreign policy part. Still, it is a document that has been interpreted in many ways, and that represents for many people a cornerstone for certain foreign policy principles, especially the doctrine of isolationism that the United States is going to follow in the following decades along the 19th century. In the farewell address, interestingly, George Washington warns against political parties, the danger of political parties, and what he means is the Democratic Republican Party, because the Federalists or the Federalist Party claim that they are the true representatives of republicanism, whereas their opponents are representatives of a limited faction of narrow interests and selfish interests. The same thing happens with the Democratic Republicans. They claim that they are the true representatives of the Republic and republicanism and the nation, whereas the Federalists are representatives of narrow interests of a certain elite minority that tries to undo the American Revolution. There are accusations and counter accusations. So this is why George Washington warns against political parties. And also there are accusations and counter accusations from both sides, each accusing the other of helping, assisting a foreign country, allying with a foreign country in order to overthrow the American government and to undo the American Revolution. The Democratic Republicans accuse the Federalists of being agents or allies of Britain that are going to conspire with Britain to give it a chance to recolonize the United States, whereas the Federalists portray the Democratic Republicans as allies to the French, who are trying to spread the anarchy, the chaos, the same type of chaos and anarchy that plague France in the United States, of course, with the help of their French allies. And the Genet affair was considered by the Federalists as a proof of this claim. So we have warning of political parties, against political parties, and also warning against getting trapped in emotional attachments towards any foreign country. And what Washington means here is the emotional attachment and the sympathy that the Democratic Republicans have towards the French and the French Revolution. The territory of the the Southwest Territory is now transformed into state, is admitted to the Union as Tennessee, 60th state of the Union, and it's the representative, the first representative in Congress of the state of Tennessee is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is going to start his career as a representative in Congress and to have another career in the military, and then he would become the president of the United States in the future. He is a very important figure. France, so in this year, after hearing about Jay's Treaty, France feels betrayed by the United States because Jay's Treaty is considered as a treaty of alliance between the United States and Great Britain, which means that the United States has betrayed the friendship and the alliance that had existed, officially at least, or theoretically, between the US and France from the American War of the Revolution due to the assistance that France gave to the United States, even though the government that gave assistance to the United States in the American Revolution is not the same that is controlling France nowadays. So France suspends all ties with America. In the same year, we have a treaty, the Treaty of Tripoli, between the US and Tripoli, now Libya, for commercial shipping rights in the Mediterranean, and also for protecting American ships against Mediterranean pirates at this time. 1797, John Adams is inaugurated as second president of the United States, and John Adams is faced with a lot of diplomatic and security and even sovereignty problems that are going to which he is going to react in a certain way that is going to be interpreted by the American public and by the Democratic Republicans as an act against liberty and against the interest of the United States. We have U.S. ships being captured by France because of the feeling of being betrayed by the Americans through Jay's Treaty. We notice that Jay's Treaty, even though it was signed between the United States and Great Britain, is going to have a great impact both on U.S.-French relations and on the internal political scene between the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans, their opponents. Another important incident is the XYZ affair. What is the XYZ affair? There are three diplomats that are sent by the United States government to France in order to find a peaceful solution to the problems of the attacks against American ships by the French. Very similar to the attempt of settling issues peacefully with Britain in Jay's Treaty. So perhaps there was an attempt at having a similar treaty with the French, but what the French officials did not accept to let U.S. diplomats talk to the French government, and I'm sorry for the mistake here. They did not try to bribe U.S. diplomats. They tried to get a bribe from U.S. diplomats plus a loan. So the French officials tried to get a bribe and a loan from the U.S. The bribe is something that was rejected by the American public as soon as the public heard of it. But What angered the administration, the Federalist administration, more is the loan, because the loan would mean a violation. The loan to France against in its war against Britain would mean a violation of the United States neutrality rights. XYZ, by the way, is a name given by American diplomats to the three people, the three French officials who tried to get a bribe and a loan from the US diplomats in order to avoid mentioning their names directly. We have at this time also the launching of the first naval ships that have already been, the building of which had already started earlier, as we have already seen. So the first two ships are launched, naval ships are launched in this year, the USS United States and the USS Constitution. This naval power is usually associated with the Federalist Party, and the Jeffersonians are going to take this program and try to undo it and try to reverse it, because naval power is associated with taxation, as we shall see in a few minutes. So we have a painting by John Trumbull of the Declaration of Independence. It's an important artistic production. 1798, the Department of the Navy is established to strengthen and to emphasize the importance of the Navy. The Congress ratifies the 11th Amendment that had already been mentioned and described, but one of the most important decisions made by the American government in this year are the Alien and Sedition Acts and their reaction to them. The Alien and Sedition Acts are acts that are used by the government in order to silence political opposition. The Federalists will use these acts against the Democratic Republican opposition and also against the French immigrants who are going to be used by the Democratic Republicans as an electoral force to give them access to power. So the Naturalization Act of 1798 extends the residence years necessary for getting US citizenship from 5 to 14 years. The Alien Act of 1798 and the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, the same year, all the same year, give the US government the right to punish, imprison, or to deport any aliens, immigrants, foreigners who are suspected of plotting against the US government. And the most controversial and the most important and significant of these acts is the Sedition Act of 1798. This act gives the US government the right to punish, to imprison any American or foreigner, but this applies to Americans. Any American, especially journalists and newspaper editors who criticizes publicly the United States government. And this is more important than the other two, the other three acts, because the other three acts do not constitute a problem for the United States public opinion, because the public sees this as a protection of the United States against the threat of anarchy and chaos associated with the French Revolution. But the Sedition Act leads to the imprisonment of many Democratic Republican newspaper editors who speak against the US government, the Federalist government, and this is considered as a violation of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, the right for which grants the public the right of freedom of expression or free speech. As a response, the states of Kentucky, Virginia, and Kentucky issue the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which are written secretly by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, which declare that the Alien and Sedition Acts are against the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and they start a tradition or a practice called nullification, in which a state can declare or gives itself the power to declare a certain act by the central government unconstitutional or null and void. And here we see another interpretation of this principle of checks and balances. At this time, it is interpreted or applied along a vertical axis, not a horizontal axis. In this year, the Mississippi territory is organized, and in the future, it is going to become the state of Mississippi. 1799, we have the shoemakers strike in Philadelphia. It's the beginning of organized labor movements. In Great Britain, trade unionism, the equivalent of trade unionism in America is labor or labor unions or labor unionism. So this is the seed perhaps of the future movements, labor movements that are going to emerge as a result of the industrialization process, especially the one starting from the 1820s. Another important movement, social movement, is Friars' Rebellion, which is an armed revolt by Pennsylvania Dutch farmers against federal direct tax on land. What is the relationship between this tax and the Navy? We said usually that the Navy is associated with taxation. This tax on land is issued by the federalist government in order to fund this newly created Navy. Once again, we see free blacks very active politically. From Philadelphia, three free blacks from Philadelphia, free blacks from Philadelphia, including Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and James Forten. We saw Jones and Allen before, who are unsuccessfully trying to petition Congress to halt or to stop the internal slave trade. The slave trade with foreign nations is already banned, but the internal slave trade is going to take more time. In this year, George Washington passes away suddenly, and he is mourned in the United States, in England, and in France as a hero. So, this is considered as a very sad event for the United States. And in this year, we have an important development in France, which is the takeover of the government in France by Napoleon Bonaparte, who would become the emperor. Now is so Napoleon Bonaparte is the first Council of France, and he is going to give himself some excessive powers and to transform France into a sort of dictatorship. And in this year, 1799, we have the publication of Charles Brockden Brown's novel, Gothic novel, Wayland, or The Transformation, an American Tale. We have the beginning of this perhaps the beginning of the literary independence. Independence in the United States starts as a political move, and then the cultural aspect, the other aspects of independence take place gradually, especially after the War of 1812. And cultural independence take longer than political independence. So usually cultural independence is related to works of art, to painting, to literature, especially novels and short stories and poetry. This is all for the first decade. Thanks for watching, and I hope we meet again in the next videos.